Iowa Off-Kilter is the product of 28 years of friendship. Gavin and I first met at Westwood Elementary in Ankeny, where we attended kindergarten, took all the same classes together, and became fast friends. Even when I moved to Madrid in second grade, you could still find him and me huddled around a TV set in Gavin's living room, trying to beat whatever Nintendo 64 game we were on that week. The setting would progress. Gavin's living room became the dorms at Iowa State in our late teens, the Ames Main Street bar scene in our mid-20s, and finally the podcast studio in our early 30s. But the two of us would always remain friends. We made different choices, we took different paths, and we became different people. And what you'll hear on this podcast might be described as the place where a Venn diagram of our interests coalesce. All of the topics and stories that we cover will share an Iowa backdrop. The theme and ambient music you'll hear on this podcast are produced by Iowa musicians. The other commonality that these stories share is that they don't always have a home in the mainstream media, which isn't as likely to talk about credible places of buried wealth around Iowa, Depression-era agrarian uprisings, or pterodactyl-esque monsters prowling the streets of a small community. But that's the meat and potatoes of Iowa Off-Kilter. We're a teaspoon of the weird, a pinch of the preternatural, and sometimes a tablespoon of the taboo.
We're going to milk our first episode for all it's worth with a look back to an event that took place 90 years ago called the Cedar County Cow War. And we're going to do that to focus on a topic that's all too familiar today: misinformation. In 2020 alone, with the coronavirus pandemic and the presidential election, we've been inundated with pseudoscientific medical advice, conspiracy theories, and all sorts of other false and misleading news. At a time when people's lives can depend on accurate information, it hasn't helped that distrust of both the media and government has been running high. In some ways, what's happening now may seem to bear little resemblance to anything that transpired nearly a century ago, and for obvious reasons. The internet, and more specifically social media outlets like Facebook and Twitter, have transformed how we as a society interact. Information and misinformation is ubiquitous. No longer are the days when people often relied on just a couple media outlets for their news, and gatekeepers were more able to filter out falsehoods. But in many other ways, the similarities between then and now are striking, and a good reminder that history does have a tendency to repeat itself, pardon the cliche, in one way or another. This is a story set in the golden era of radio. It's a story about farmers impoverished by economic forces beyond their direct control. And it's a story about a charismatic radio host whose fiery populist rhetoric drove them to rise up against their perceived oppressors.
So grab a camp chair from the shed, put on a hoodie if you're cold, and join us around the fire as we regale you with tales of the Off-Kilter. All right, everyone, welcome to Iowa Off-Kilter. My name is Kelly Michael Bevins.
Hey everybody, I'm Gavin Arnson.
And, well, this is our very first episode, Gav. Where should we start?
Good question. How about we look back to last year, where we started at the beginning of the year, and then with all the crazy unexpected stuff that happened, how we got from there to where we are now with this podcast.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Gavin and I had been looking to do a project together for quite some time. In fact, we worked on a podcast together until about March of 2020, when COVID-19 really hit. Now, COVID-19 sort of put a pin on that last project, but now that we've learned a little bit more about the pandemic and how to operate safely within it, we decided to jump back on the horse. But we took it in a different direction this time. We took it in an Iowa direction, and we took it in a weird one.
And a lot of my professional background has been in alternative journalism, so that's a direction I tried to take with this project as well, covering issues from a different perspective and more depth, something a little more quirky or informal or at times vulgar than what you typically see in Iowa's mainstream press.
Yeah, and every episode will try to feature something unique, like an interview with an expert or recordings from our road trips or maybe just information that might not be readily available to the public.
We'd also love to hear from you. If you have a good idea, maybe something in your own family's history that's really interesting, or if you happen to know about something, past or present, that would fit the theme of the podcast, or even something that has been in the news a lot lately, but that you think you've got an original take on. So if you do have any ideas for us, or you just like to stop in and say hi, you can find us online at iowaoffkilter.com.
Yeah, we'd love to hear your ideas or your feedback. In fact, usually we would reserve this portion of the show for viewer mail, questions and answers, or topics that we generally consider to be the business side of things.
Yeah, we don't have any hate mail to share with you just yet.
Gives us something to shoot for. If you're interested, check out iowaoffkilter.com.
That's right, and there you can also find links to our Patreon and our social media accounts.
Well, the sun's setting on the horizon. The cows have made their way home. So let's stoke the fire, settle in, and let us spin you a yarn.
Contrary to the teachings of the American Medical Associations, cancer is curable. If all cases could be treated in their early stages, I believe I could make a positive statement that cancer is conquered. Until someone accepts this challenge and proves that we are fakers, quacks, and charlatans, the world owes us its help and confidence.
You could make the argument that the Cedar County Cow War of 1931 actually began in 1929. That's the year that the Great Depression began, and it's also the year that the Iowa legislature mandated testing of tuberculosis in cattle.
And before we get too far into this, Gav, what is tuberculosis?
That's a good question because it's not a virus. It's a bacteria that can cause an infectious disease that's typically found in someone's lungs. And to give you a sense of the seriousness of tuberculosis, or TB, up to 10% of people with a latent infection develop the contagious disease. And without proper treatment, that can lead to death for about half of them.
Now, it's been around for a while, right?
Yeah, there's actually some really interesting history here. Scientists have found evidence of infection in mummies in Egypt, and even as far back as 4000 BC in prehistoric humans. Ancient Greeks and a lot of other cultures had their own names for TB, and it's even been associated in folklore with vampires.
So, when did people realize that tuberculosis and vampires weren't related? I mean,
Well, that depends on who you ask.
Yeah, who discovered TB?
It was discovered by a guy named Robert Koch. He was a German physician and microbiologist, and he published his findings in 1882.
So obviously TB was a very serious disease, but what about Iowa? What kind of a role did TB play in Iowa?
Well, in 1894, the state veterinarian of Iowa declared TB to be the top problem his office faced. And that was specifically because of how it was impacting cattle, but also hogs and poultry. Around the turn of the century, TB became known as the White Plague in Iowa. And that's because of the very pale complexion people got from it. Getting more specific, in 1906, and that's 25 years before the Cow War, 7,000 to 8,000 Iowans were infected with TB, and there were about 2,000 deaths. Here's the advice that the Iowa Board of Health published that year. Boil handkerchiefs for half an hour, keep carpets, curtains, and upholstered furniture out of the room, shave off beards and mustaches, open the bedroom window night and day, and spit in a pasteboard cup and burn it afterward.
That's interesting because I've heard the beards and mustaches line used with the coronavirus today.
Yeah, I remember that was a meme that was going around early on, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, in 1917, and this isn't specific to Iowa, but it plays into the Cow War, the Federal Bureau of Animal Industry, which is now part of the USDA, they established what they call the Tuberculosis Eradication Division. And this is where the testing across the country really took off.
Yeah, and they called that the tuberculin test. And what it was a test where a veterinarian would come to a farm, inject the cow underneath its tail, and then return 72 hours later to view the injection site. And if the site were red and swollen, they would classify it as a reactor cow, and that meant a cow with tuberculosis.
From 1917 to 1940, nearly 4 million cattle were culled as a result of TB testing.
Yeah, and culling that many sick cattle is definitely going to have an impact on the farming industry. So when the Iowa legislature passed the testing mandate in 1929, it quickly became a polarizing issue. Iowa Governor Dan Turner sided with the legislature that testing should be required, and this was supported by many farmers across the state.
Of course, other farmers were adamantly opposed to the mandate, and this was demonstrated shortly after the law was passed by several lawsuits that were filed, not only in Cedar County, farmers in Mitchell County, which is in northern Iowa, a few counties away from there. There was also an effort to appeal the mandate in the federal court system, but this challenge was dismissed because the courts there ruled that this was a matter of state law. Frustrated by their lack of success in the courts, farmers began to shift their focus to protests on the ground. When populist politics were at their height across America during the 1890s, Iowa hadn't followed suit. But the economic and cultural factors of the late 1920s and early 30s left farmers susceptible to the populist message. If you're not familiar with the term, populism is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. It's the age-old word to describe a politician who portrays themselves as a commoner, perennially engaged in the David and Goliath-esque battle with societal elites. And that's just who a man named Norman Baker was.
Norman Baker was the man at the center of the Iowa Cow War. He inspired the local Union figures and bolstered the resolve of the farmers by giving them a scapegoat for their troubles. Baker wasn't just a populist. He was a genius, according to Dr. Eric Yunke, a history professor who in 1994 wrote an award-winning thesis at the University of Northern Iowa called Iowa's Wolf in Populist Clothing, which centered around Baker and his involvement in the cow war.
My name is Eric Yunke, and I'm a professor of history at Briarcliff University. One of my areas of interest and expertise is kind of the social history of medicine. I first got interested in the cow war for my senior thesis project when I was an undergraduate student. I started studying it back in the early 1990s, then it became part of my master's thesis, and later a part of my dissertation, and eventually a book that I had published in 2002 called Quacks and Crusaders.
Could you tell us a little more about your book?
That book, again, which originally started with my interest in the cow war, focused on three of the most successful charlatans of the 20th century. Norman Baker was one, who was a cancer charlatan from Muscatine, Iowa. And then I also looked at John Brinkley, a contemporary of Baker's, who had an operation in Kansas. And then Harry Hoxsey, another cancer charlatan who for a while was in practice with Baker at his institute in Muscatine.
Baker lived a pretty normal childhood, all things considered. He was precocious and smart, but he dropped out of high school in pursuit of adventure and showmanship.
Norman Baker was from Muscatine. His father was an inventor, a machinist. He seemed to pass some of those skills and interests to his son. I think Norman Baker was maybe the 10th child. He was a machinist then, an inventor. He ended up inventing numerous things, but he also became active on the vaudeville circuit. He developed a mentalist act where he read people's minds, did some hypnotism and mental telepathy, those kinds of things. So he did that for a number of years before coming back to Sioux City and opening his own machinist shop. His big breakthrough was he invented kind of an improvement on a calliope. It was a mobile pipe organ instrument that could be used like at fairs and carnivals. And he patented that, called it a calliophone, and made quite a bit of money. And then he was an entrepreneur, and he started developing other things. He got into like a art correspondence school. and then got involved in mail order business, and that brought him to the radio, and then things went from there.
And Baker's rise to fame was no fluke. He was a natural businessman with a penchant for theatrics.
One remarkable example of this happened in May 1930, when Baker drew a crowd of 32,000 people to his radio station. There, they watched in amazement as Baker's doctors appeared to remove part of the scalp and skull of a man named Mandus Johnson, exposing what looked like cancerous brain tissue. The cancer was cured with Baker's magic elixir. In reality, a medically useless mix of spring water, watermelon seeds, and carbolic acid.
The Journal of the American Medical Association would later cite this episode in its efforts to discredit Baker. It described the cancer surgery as a hoax, explaining that Johnson suffered from inflammation of the outer part of his skull caused by a medical condition. But this is exactly what Baker had told his audience would happen as part of organized medicine's fight to maintain its monopoly.
He was really a genius. He was an incredible entrepreneur. He had a flair and an ability to attract people to what he was doing and to support him. I mean, the guy made money, and it was because of his business skill. He was already, very successful with his mail order business. He was selling everything from, beans to overalls.
Besides good business sense and a knack for entrepreneurship, Baker had panache.
This guy had an amazing style. He always wore white suits with lavender ties. Purple was his favorite color. His radio station and his institute were decked out in purple decor. He drove a convertible Franklin Roadster that was purple, and it had bulletproof glass, and it had air conditioning in the 1920s. I mean, he just had a lot of style, a lot of charisma. You could understand why, people just would want to check him out.
Given the time of these events, Baker's larger-than-life personality and personal flair might be something straight out of a movie. Pappy O'Daniels from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou comes to mind. And much like Pappy, he needed a way to mass communicate.
Baker endeavored to start his own station there in Muscatine, and it was not easy for him to do so. He was up against some large forces, a radio monopoly, as he called it, but he pushed on and ended up developing some of his own radio equipment, his own transmitter and stuff, going through some of that on his own. Some of his machinist skills helped him out, but he received a radio license in 1925 and launched his radio station called KTNT. It was an acronym for Know the Naked Truth.
Know the naked truth. But how much of Baker's struggle into the radio business was truth? And how much did he distort in order to play the victim?
I think, you're absolutely right. He was very good at playing the victim, but there was some truth to this. This was the early days of radio. We didn't have the FCC yet. We didn't even have yet the Federal Radio Commission. Radio just had started really in 1920 with the first commercial station out of Pittsburgh. So it was really in its age of infancy. But, they really didn't know what's the role of radio? They weren't really sure. No one knew what it was going to be. And so it was wide open for people like Baker to make it into what they wanted it to. And what he wanted to make it into was a moneymaker, for himself and to launch his businesses and to catapult himself into the spotlight. And he could legitimately argue that he was fighting on behalf of the little guy of rural Iowans to bring this new technology. And he's fighting against those big-powered elites that are trying to control everything. So there was some legitimacy to this.
But how does a man who owns an entire radio station appeal to the struggling and often impoverished farmers of the Depression?
He's casting himself as one of them. The people that he's selling to and the people that he's broadcasting for, they're Iowans and rural people from Illinois as well. They're farmers, and they're unsettled with modernity and the changes that are taking place, new technology, the new values, urbanization, and all of these things that are going on very rapidly in the 1920s, and yet Baker is bringing that, in a sense, to them in Muscatine. He's bringing modernity to rural folks, I'm doing this for you. And at this station, we're not going to play the chain music. We're not going to play opera. We're not going to do what they do in big city stations. I'm going to play folk music. We're going to have live entertainment. It's going to be modern, but it's going to be catered to rural tastes.
And Baker's magnetic personality wasn't lost in translation over the medium of radio.
He came across as an authority. He was bombastic, but people didn't maybe recognize right off the hucksterism in him, and he seemed to know what he was talking about. He was brash.
As his influence grew, so did Baker's use of other mediums to share his message.
He also had a newspaper which had as high as maybe 15,000 subscribers. He also had a magazine called TNT. So he reached a lot of people. And by the late 1920s, his radio station, KTNT, was running at 10,000 watts, which allowed him to actually, they were picking up, the broadcasts in Canada and even in one contest in Hawaii.
As Baker expanded his reach, he would encourage his followers to cancel subscriptions to their local publications and just read his. His unchecked ability to say whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, delivered a steady stream of conspiratorial populist rhetoric.
Baker kind of developed this belief in mind over body and his ability to kind of control his own health. He was warning about the danger of aluminum. Yes, he was concerned about vaccinations. He wondered over the radio out loud, why do physicians choose to vaccinate for some vaccinations in the leg, children's in the leg? Is it, do they want to gaze upon the nude parts of children? Just grotesque imagery. He talked in conspiratorial, and I would say not just conspiracies, populist terms. Us, the little guy, versus them, the elites. That was always big for Baker.
Now that the courts had dismissed the farmers' cases, it was time for the protests on the ground. We saw that start in March of 1931, when a group called the Farmers Protective Association took roughly 1,000 farmers on a train from Tipton in Cedar County to the state capitol building in Des Moines. Now, leading this group were a couple of figureheads in our story, and that's Jacob Lanker and Paul Moore.
Lanker and Moore were both leaders in the FPA, and you can also think of them as two of the leading people on the ground who were really carrying Norman Baker's torch in terms of his anti-test rhetoric.
And they'd been doing this for a while. Lanker and the FPA had been holding secretive meetings with other farmers in the area. They had been wanting to start a campaign to repeal the mandatory testing law, and going to the state capitol was sort of like the first step in that process.
And the plan here was simple. They wanted to confront state lawmakers and just demand that they repeal the law.
And how'd that go for them?
Well, that did not work. So here's when you see the protests that are starting on the ground with more efforts to directly disrupt the testing itself.
What that looked like was sort of a standoff between state veterinarians and farmers, where the veterinarians were insisting on performing the tests on the cattle, and the farmers were simply saying no.
Yeah, so here you see direct action, civil disobedience, and in a sense, pretty standard, age-old protest tactics. There were a couple notable examples that happened early on in Cedar County that give you an idea of, more specifically, how the farmers tried to disrupt the testing. One was the Hogan Farm protest, where a veterinarian was literally just chased off the land.
And the second was also in mid-March, where farmers gathered at the E.C. Mitchell farm to prevent the tests from being carried out. The Des Moines Register actually published aerial photographs of the Mitchell farm, showing how the farmers had parked their automobiles in a way to block out the veterinarians. And we talked about how this was mostly isolated to Cedar County, but it wasn't completely isolated. In rural areas of southeastern Iowa, there are accounts of how veterinarians were met with thrown eggs or mud, and some were even kicked by farmers' wives.
So yeah, this is kind of comedic in a way, but it was also pretty sophisticated. Some of these anti-test farmers would set up telephone systems where they would alert each other when they spotted a veterinarian coming onto their land. And this is effective in mobilizing farmers. Sometimes they are asked to bring pitchforks or axes even, kind of in a show of intimidation.
Yeah, and a lot of that intimidation, I think, came from Norman Baker. Baker's been sort of whispering anti-test rhetoric into the ear of the common farmer. The mood of the farmers at this point couldn't really be described as great. I mean, against the backdrop of the Depression and drought, a lot of farmers went into debt, and some even lost their land.
Another factor that I thought was pretty interesting is something you still hear a lot about today, and that's the urban-rural divide.
Yeah, and I think that was definitely something that was occurring at this time. You sort of saw a shift from rural populations that were moving into the trendier cities, and that sort of became the thing to do. The 1920 census showed a rise in the population of Iowa as a whole, but rural population had decreased significantly.
And this demographic shift played into the other economic issues that farmers were facing at the time.
Yeah, the agricultural boom of the 1900s and 1910s had faded. Prices for commodities were dropping as operating costs were increasing. Decreasing land value crippled many farmers. And as chief landowners of Iowa, farmers were responsible for most of the property taxes. So when Iowa's rural population decreased, the farmers footed the bill. And to add salt to the wound, the farmers were reimbursed for the loss of a reactor cow, that is, a cow that's tested positive for TB, but they were only partially reimbursed. 1/3 came from the state government, 1/3 came from the federal government, but that last third, the farmers simply lost.
It is only necessary that you make a donation to ensure that this fight will go on to the finish. You may give any amount from $1 up and you will be listed as a member. I suggest that you give and give until it hurts. This is one time in the history of America when the people must organize to rout this infernal beast, the giant medical octopus.
Norman Baker's radio station, KTNT, got shut down in June of 1931.
But that didn't stop Baker, did it?
No, I think it's pretty clear that Baker is not the type who gave up easily. And he still had other outlets, like his print publications, the Midwest Free Press, for example. That same month that his radio station was shut down, it had a circulation of 10,000.
But remember, the radio station wasn't shut down until about 3 months before the climax of the cow war. And with the circulation of Midwest Free Press being so strong, it wasn't long before the protests escalated. So we've seen minor protests throughout the spring and summer of 1931, and on September 11th, the town of Tipton actually began to organize its officers and deputies.
This wasn't an overt show of force, really. It was done without the knowledge of the farmers in anticipation of further escalation.
Yeah, it was more covert than overt, I would say. And it was actually all for a good reason, because it was only 10 days later that we had the incident on Jacob Lanker's farm.
Yeah, Jacob Lanker, the leader of the Farmers Protective Association, along with Paul Moore and those two kind of leading acolytes of Norman Baker.
So that day we saw officers and deputies congregate secretly at the courthouse. There were 65 officers and they were armed with tear gas bombs. But when they congregated, word leaked out and the farmers began to assemble.
This detail reminded me of some of the protests that I've actually covered as a reporter, more recently, obviously, where before riot police break up a crowd and make arrests, they'll sometimes do what's called staging, where they set up in a nearby location and then protesters will be trying to scope them out to give their side advance notice of when the cops are on the move.
So we've got both law enforcement and the farmers kind of congregating here, right?
Stage is set for a showdown.
Absolutely. As the officers, deputies, and veterinarians set out to perform the test, farmers followed in their own vehicles. And when those officers stopped their cars, the posse of farmers actually parked their cars to surround the veterinarians and officers. Now, they were met with resistance, but exactly how much resistance, we're not sure. It's been reported that between 200 and 400 farmers were present that day. And when the farmers got out of their vehicles, they began to hurl rocks and mud at the cars of the officers and veterinarians.
And the farmers weren't just targeting police and veterinarians either. There were also reporters on the scene with cameras, and they were threatening them with rocks, telling them to get out of there.
Yeah, and when one officer finally did attempt to exit his vehicle, he was immediately pushed into the mud.
And this was foreshadowed by one of the protesters who reportedly shouted out,
"Here's mud in your eye!"
Now, another officer threw a tear gas bomb at the farmers, but And the comically cartoonish twist, the wind blew the gas back towards law enforcement and the veterinarians.
You can kind of see this whole thing playing out as a cartoon strip, can't you? Both the tear gassing themselves, then the "here's mud in your eye" quote, and
yeah, it's a Far Side cartoon too. There's a little Far Side there as well.
The only difference is the cows weren't talking here.
Yeah, but in a sense, the farmers were successful here, right? They held back the veterinarians and they held back the officers.
So they won the battle, if not the war. Paul Moore, the FPA leader, was present at the Linker protests too. And he was quoted saying something that maybe was a sign of his overconfidence from the success of the day's events. He said, "Farmers, I held you back this time, but the next time, I won't have anything to say. Kill them if you can."
So, where were the elected officials during all of this? Well, shortly before the Lanker Farm incident, Governor Dan Turner had returned from Washington, D.C., where he'd been attending a conference regarding the price of corn. Now, state and county officials had reacted to the Lanker Farm protest by pressing the governor to send in the state militia.
And as pressure mounted on the governor to do this, rumors began to spread among the farmers that indeed that's what he planned to do.
But that didn't help anything, did it?
It didn't stop him from protesting. So by the next day, the governor had declared martial law, and he had the following statement he used to justify his position, quote, "Where men are organized against government, there is only one thing to do, and that is to put down the insurrection. That is exactly what I propose to do in Cedar County."
And again, I think we're seeing parallels from that time to this time, though, quotes about insurrection and things like that.
Oh yeah, it's so frequent here.
So about 2,000 members of the State National Guard were put on trains bound for Cedar County. Now, that was about 1/3 of all State National Guard members in Iowa. They were commanded by Brigadier General Park Findley, who commanded 31 companies from 20 Iowa cities, and the first trainload of about 450 troops arrived at 6 a.m. on the day after the Lanker Farm incident.
And this was reportedly quite the sight. National Guardsmen, as they departed for Tipton, were hanging their heads out of the train car windows, waving farewell. One was quoted as saying, "It was going to be a well war. If it lasts long enough, we'll all get fat on milk."
Yeah, it seemed like they weren't taking this super seriously. In fact, when they set up camp in Tipton, they nicknamed their camp Camp Bovine, or alternatively Cow Camp.
According to the Waterloo Courier, after hearing about the events on the Linker Farm, the governor also said, "The law will be enforced in the state. I will not under any circumstance countenance any opposition to the laws of the state. I mean business."
And he did mean business, didn't he? When the National Guard showed up in force, they went so far as to set up machine gun posts at the crossroads and had National Guardsmen escort 22 teams of veterinarians who were brought in from around the state to expedite the process.
So, what was Norman Baker's role in all of this? We asked Dr. Yunke.
Baker's role was that of an instigator. Baker was the main catalyst, that he convinced Jacob Linker that he was George Washington fighting against tyranny. Baker sensed there was some unease among farmers, and he recognized all of their concerns and just fueled them to new heights. What he did was he gave them some scapegoats. He gave them some people to lash out at, and up until the summer of 1931, he used KT&T, a radio station, to egg on resistance. There were legitimate reasons for farmers to question the test, even without Norman Baker. I mean, it was, this was, kind of new technology, the testing of cattle. There were some concerns that farmers had about how it was done. I mean, they, thought that the veterinarians could manipulate the test. They complained that the veterinarians just left their needles out, in infected areas, and they reused the needles. They complained that the shot hurt cows. It caused cows to abort their babies. And then there's also this kind of libertarian, concern of these outsiders, these vets coming in and messing with my cattle. And, I don't trust them. I don't trust the science, and I don't like people, messing with my private property.
And these so-called outsiders did, well, mess with their cattle. From 1917 until 1940, veterinarians across the United States administered more than 232 million tuberculin tests on cattle. 3.8 million cows were culled in the process.
Baker, he spoke to all of these things. He discounted the tests. He claimed the actual strain of tuberculosis in cattle couldn't even be transferred to humans, so he said it's not useful anyway. He said that the test was inaccurate and that there was a better test that could be developed, and that the test was, again, being manipulated. And then economically, he said this was a conspiracy, that the meatpacking industry was in collusion with state veterinarians, and they were trying to get as much beef made as be made condemned, and then they would take this beef and then they would sell it to consumers at a discount price.
In its decision upholding the testing mandate, the Iowa Supreme Court addressed some of these points because they were also made by the farmers from Mitchell County who challenged the law. In his opinion, Justice James W. Kindig wrote that there was, quote, an abundance of evidence that the tuberculin test was reliable and that bovine tuberculosis was transferable to people. He dismissed claims about injuries from testing causing things like abortions as the, quote, mere conclusions of non-experts.
But Baker wasn't a farmer himself. What was he ultimately trying to accomplish by involving himself in the cow war?
I think just notoriety, that was key for him. Part of this was feeding his own ego, perhaps, but also garnering more attention for his hospital and his businesses. This is really at the height of his power and his popularity, and also his notoriety in 1930, 1931. And Baker was, he was controversial, but he was a celebrity. He led the way. And I think in some ways, people just, maybe they were, a lot of people were uncomfortable with him because he was brash, he was obscene at times, he was way over the top in his personal attacks. But in some ways, some people, I think, enjoyed it. He would show up at fairs, at gatherings, and wherever he went, he attracted a crowd. So part of him being in this was just loving the limelight, but I think also part of it was everyone that knew his name and went to see him, he hoped would purchase one of his mail order products and maybe send someone to go get a treatment at his hospital.
So how did the cow war end? Well, in a later deposition, Paul Moore would be quoted as saying, "It does not make any difference how big an army they bring in. We can get plenty of men to take care of them." But we didn't really see that being the case. Iowa historian George Mills later said that objecting farmers gave in almost without exception to the show of force.
Yeah, you might say they kowtowed in the end.
Exactly, yeah. And this didn't end the resistance completely, but the arrival of the National Guard largely put the protests out to pasture,
Okay.
especially after several of the farmers were charged with crimes.
And you just mentioned Paul Moore in a deposition, so that was one of them.
Correct. So Paul Moore and Jacob Lanker were arrested after the September 21st incident on Lanker Farm. Now, we have that quote from Paul Moore's deposition, but we also have a quote from Jacob Lanker's deposition. This was in response to the Attorney General, whose name was Oral Swift.
A great name for the time here.
Yeah, exactly. And Oral Swift was saying that the tuberculin law had to be obeyed. Jacob Lanker replied, "If George Washington had not been an outlaw, we would still be under English rule."
So even 90 years ago, invoking the name of a founding father.
Yeah, you see this whenever rights and liberties are at stake.
These arrests were a pretty big deal at the time, as you can probably imagine, since Moore and Lanker were basically the two leaders of the cow war.
Along with Norman Baker.
Right, yeah, and he wasn't on the ground for the cow war. He didn't get arrested for that, but he had plenty of run-ins with the law himself.
Yeah, we'll get into that later.
And the arrests were reported throughout the state. We took a look through some newspaper archives. Some of the papers this was reported in were in eastern Iowa, the Davenport Democrat, and then in Des Moines, the Tribune Capital, which no longer exists, and then, of course, the Register still does. We found stuff in there, too. So initially, Lanker was bonded out of jail, but there were terms of release that came with that were meant to prevent him from interfering in further testing efforts.
So Lanker's protesting days were over.
That was certainly the state's intent. And the state pretty much got its way because Lanker and Moore were actually arrested a second time shortly thereafter. and accused of conspiring to violate Iowa's tuberculin testing law. Now, these charges actually predated that September 21st protests on Linker's farm. This was back in their initial efforts in the spring 1931. They were both ultimately convicted on those criminal conspiracy charges and sentenced to 3 years in the state penitentiary in Fort Madison. And that prison, by the way, still exists today in Lee County. It's a maximum security prison there. But they were both paroled long before that 3-year sentence was actually up.
But these weren't the only arrests, right? There were a handful of other charges.
Yeah, so one name we mentioned earlier in the podcast was E.C. Mitchell. He was another farmer from Cedar County who held a protest on his farm in the spring of 1931. He was arrested as a result of that resistance. Another example, in August, there were 3 farmers who were charged with contempt of court for the same reason. And later, a couple of farmers named Carl Reichs and R.P. Broders were arrested for refusing to allow the testing after about 25 people gathered on Broders' farm, and Broders was accused of attacking the veterinarians.
The bulk of the resistance to the testing was quelled in the fall of 1931, and by 1935, all of Iowa's 99 counties had completed testing, and the state was officially recognized as being in compliance by the Federal Bureau of Animal Industry. So let's move on to the repercussions of the cow war. Governor Dan Turner's opposition to the cow war may have cost him re-election. In 1932, he lost to a Democrat named Clyde Laverne Herring.
But there were also broader political factors at play in 1932 because that was the year that FDR swept Republicans from office just across the nation. This would be the last time, by the way, that a political party would cede control of the House, Senate, and presidency in a single term, until 2021 after the Georgia Senate runoffs.
And although Turner's support for the mandatory testing hurt his reputation with Norman Baker and the anti-testing farmers, he continued to be a friend of the farmer throughout his life. In the mid-1950s, when Turner was 78 years old, he helped found the National Farmers Organization, which was initially headquartered in his hometown of Corning.
And later it moved to Ames, where I live, but I can't say that I'm too familiar with it.
Not a friend of the farmer, huh?
Well, hey, don't Norman Baker me here. Let's talk a little bit about tuberculosis after the cow war, too. You might remember us talking earlier about how in 1925, 6 years before it started, there were about 1,000 deaths from tuberculosis in Iowa. Now, by 1934, 9 years later, and 3 years after most of the cow war was over, that number was down to 600. By comparison, and this is pretty apples to oranges, but just maybe for a frame of reference, by early January 2021, there were over 4,000 deaths from COVID-19 in Iowa, and the population now is about 670,000 people more than it was back in 1934. 12 years after that, in 1946, Iowa had the lowest death rate actually in the nation from tuberculosis, and it was no longer even a leading cause of death in the state by 1950.
In the 1990s, researchers were optimistic that tuberculosis could be eradicated, but that is yet to happen. And the World Health Organization estimates it continues to infect about 10 million people worldwide per year, about 1.5 million of whom end up dying.
And as a side note, tuberculosis has also still been confirmed in animals. There was actually bovine tuberculosis found in a llama herd in Iowa a few decades ago. And deer, elk, and even giraffes have also tested positive.
Dr. Morris Fishbein, editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, who so freely branded me as a quack, faker, and charlatan for using my radio station, KTNT, in Muscatine, Iowa, to advertise a cancer cure, shall pay for his damaging slander.
As for Norman Baker, well, along with the decline of tuberculosis in cattle came his own decline.
After the cow war, he lost his radio station in the midst of the cow war. The Federal Radio Commission pulled the plug on his station in June of 1931.
But the Federal Radio Commission wasn't the only organization that had beef with Norman Baker.
The Journal of American Medicine really started to go after Baker and his hospital and published a series of exposés on his hospital.
And as you can imagine, Baker didn't go quietly.
Baker tried to fight back by filing a libel suit against the head of the Journal of American Medical Association. So there was a trial in Muscatine in 1932, and Baker just failed miserably. The AMA, which supported counsel in the case, proved he was a quack, and the judge and the jury agreed he was a quack, and he lost his case, and he lost a lot of credibility, I think, in Iowa.
So, Baker went somewhere else.
He took off then shortly thereafter, looking for greener pastures where he could once again get in the radio business. And so he went to Nuevo Laredo, Texas, and opened up one of the first border blaster stations across the Rio Grande. He opened another cancer hospital in Nuevo Laredo, and then later in 1937, he moved his cancer hospital operation to Eureka Springs, Arkansas, where he set up shop, and he ran that hospital for 3 years until the feds got him for mail fraud.
Yes, the law eventually caught up with our aging charlatan.
He was brought up on charges and sentenced to 3 years in the pen, and he served 3 years in Leavenworth, and he never recovered after that. He just kind of lived in obscurity in a yacht off the coast of Miami until his death in the 1950s.
But what lasting legacy did Baker leave behind? What were the broader implications statewide of the Iowa Cow War?
The cow war is not really a war, of course. There's nobody is killed. It's more of a confrontation. It cost the state some money, and in the eyes of many Iowa farmers, it was an embarrassment for the state. Once Iowa farmers, the majority of them bought into the testing, and that already by 1931 that was the case. Many farmers were not pleased with what Baker was doing, because here now this is Iowa milk and Iowa meat that's being sold, and we're getting national attention that Iowa is resisting this effort, which was nationwide, to clean up the cattle industry from tuberculosis, and here Iowa's resisting. So it rankled a lot of people, and it ultimately, when the troops were brought in, it failed.
If many in the state were embarrassed by Baker and his movement, how did it gain such a following?
I think it's important to understand, because he had this station, and because he attracted so much attention, it was just exciting, I think, for many people to be around him, and in the crowds that showed up at Muscatine during the summers. He would take the show at the station outside, and thousands of people would come, on a kind of a picnic festival type atmosphere. And then, his medicine shows that he had, again, thousands would come. It was exciting for people. It attracted politicians. They couldn't ignore. For many people, this was just entertaining. It was maybe they didn't agree with everything that he did, but it's just fun to be around. I mean, in southeastern Iowa, to have this guy that attracted so much attention and so many people were after him, and yet the crowds came. It was just cool, I think, for many people.
This left us wondering, who exactly did Baker see himself as? A grifter, holding his followers upside down, shaking the change out of their pockets, knowingly exploiting their frustrations and offering them false hope? Or was he a true believer in his own message and the image he presented of himself to the public? That of a noble philanthropist.
It's a tough question. Did Baker believe that what he was doing was righteous, and were they actually curing people? I never found in my research a smoking gun. What I did find was that he repeatedly misrepresented the status of his patients. And he claimed that people were cured in advertisements that he distributed not only over the radio, but in print advertisements of people who had not been cured, but were in fact dead. And that, to me, is a sign of conscious deceit.
And while we've talked a lot today about history, there were a lot of similarities between the events of the Iowa Cow War and the events that unfolded over the past year. We asked Dr. Yunke to compare Baker to a modern public figure, and if he sees any signs of Norman Baker's message still present in politics today.
I have to say that when I heard the charge that I think our Senator Joni Ernst jumped on, that doctors were saying people were COVID positive to make money, that it was part of a conspiracy. That's just language right from Norman Baker. Hey, this was fun. It's always fun to talk about Norman Baker and the cow war. If you can believe it, not many people want to talk to me about it. Okay, take care, guys. Bye bye.
If you're interested in learning more about Midwest hucksters, check out Yunke's book, Quacks and Crusaders, The Fabulous Careers of John Brinkley, Norman Baker, and Harry Hoxsey. We mentioned before that we picked the cow war because of the parallels we saw between then and today, so let's chat a little bit about them. Let's start with sort of the backdrop and the hardships that were encountered. I think back then, of course, we had the Depression in the 20s and the early 30s, and today we have the coronavirus as a catalyst, right?
Oh yeah, the pandemic's really changed things. Also, if you go back a few years, and 2009, the Great Recession.
You've fallen on hard times, and no one's there to help you out. You feel like the government should be doing something, right?
Yeah, and that's easy to understand. I think there's that saying that poverty is really expensive.
Yeah,
and just adds a lot of stress to someone's life.
Yeah, and you push so much stress, and something's got to break, right? So when someone comes along and says they have the answers to that stress, you want to believe them, even if their message is misinformation, right? Even if they're saying they have the cure for cancer, as in the case of Norman Baker.
And one thing that I think is important too is sometimes it's more about just that sense of community more so than even like the whatever ideological issue or disagreement there is. Because when you have a sense of belonging, especially when you're feeling these things we talked about before, like isolation and all these different things, that really is important for a human being to have. And if it's that, maybe that fulfills that need. Yeah,
it's easier to accept a lot of different truths and untruths because of that, right? Just for the sake of bonding.
And another thing with the cow war was, you kind of touched on it, just getting people to not be sure what the science really says. You see that obviously with a lot of stuff today, whether it's, vaccinations or, different things with COVID-19. It's very, easy also to make different things sound true by taking, bits of like I don't know if you ever read an academic, peer-reviewed academic article in a journal. But they're very dense, and it's easy to kind of isolate certain facts or a chart in there, and like that's not maybe the overall conclusion, but it's just one data point.
Yeah, they'll pull this fact from here and kind of misrepresent it, what it's actually saying.
Baker, I think, did some of that, but he also just invented stuff totally out of nothing, like like you cure cancer.
Yeah, and sort of the split of the truth there, that now there's sort of two truths, where I think Norman Baker was kind of spouting his own truth, which may have gone against the actual truth of the times.
Yeah, once you get people, like once someone gets on that train of thought, it's very hard to change it.
And I think that kind of ties into the conspiracy theories we see here too.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. One thing that was really crazy to me was this incident where he removed the top of someone's head to like cure their cancer, and that was later shown to be a hoax. But
he employed various tricks, literal tricks, almost magician style type of events here to quote unquote prove that he had the answer to cancer, right?
Yeah.
We have I think a lot of the same sort of projection issues, where Norman Baker, a guy who's selling a false cure for profit, accusing others of doing exactly that. And it seems like a lot of the things Norman Baker was doing, he was accusing the opposite side of doing.
And there's endless examples, of course, of that in like politics today.
Oh God,
that we will spare you.
Yeah, we'll kind of maneuver away from that one. We also saw, like we talked about, the appeal to the founding fathers, right?
Oh yeah, and I'd be curious to see how far back in history we could find that goes. Was
1777.
Yeah, were people doing that when George Washington was still alive, or was this kind of a like more of like a mythology after his death, where he was idealized? I think that's the sense I get a lot. Where people have these very these views of infallible, characters from American history, but
Yeah.
of course they were very flawed human beings like the rest of us.
And it's a tried and true message, but again, they can cherry pick, right? Pick what you want to say and then use a well-known, well-respected name from history to say it, right?
Oh yeah.
The last thing I think we saw was the infringement of rights and the argument that basic safety precautions are an infringement of rights, right?
Yeah, and of course, you see that today, like whether or not to wear masks, whether or not to mandate masks.
Yeah, it's interesting how some things are susceptible to that, but you don't see anyone out there protesting against seatbelts, right?
Yeah, although I wonder if I don't know much about this. I wonder if there were back, right when they were, first mandated.
I don't know. Was there seatbelt like?
Maybe we could call, I don't know, Ralph Nader or something. He was big on that back in the day.
Were there seatbelt protests? Yeah.
Skepticism can be healthy, at least when you've got a grasp on the foundational facts. But as the past year I think has shown, that can be pretty challenging, even for people who follow current events closely. While there were fewer sources of information and misinformation to compete with someone's attention back in the days of Norman Baker, it's easy to see similarities between the falsehoods he spread on the radio and the sea of misleading information on, say, social media or AM talk radio today. A big part of Baker's success was in his ability to understand the frustrations of his listeners and offer them the answers they wanted to hear to the problems they faced. And as I hope we've illustrated with the story of the Cow War, the misinformation we see today is not a unique problem in Iowa's history. I do think we are at a challenging point in time right now with the media grappling with the increasing beliefs in things not rooted in truth, and as the news industry continues to struggle. It's a problem that will require not only some creative solutions from journalists, but also an open mind and a critical eye from the people they're trying to inform.
We're just as vulnerable to lies and misinformation as we've ever been. It's notable that the only counties that violently resisted the mandatory testing were counties where Norman Baker held considerable influence. It only took one charismatic, snake oil selling quack delivering a populist message and spreading lies and conspiracies to turn an otherwise rational group of people irrational. It might be easy to dismiss the actions of the farmers as extreme, but it's worth asking. Would these events really play out that much differently today? Well, thanks for hanging around the campfire with us. For more information, please visit iowaoffkilter.com. Check out the Contact Us section of the website if you have comments, suggestions, or just want to say hi. If you'd like to help us chop wood, follow the link to our Patreon. Thanks again to Dr. Eric Yunke for his donation of time and insight to today's show. And another big thanks to Jordan Mayland, Phil Young, and Diana Weizar for the music you heard on this podcast. Also thanks to Tanvi Rostogi for her artwork. Signing off, I'm Kelly Michael Bevins.
And I'm Gavin Aronson.
And thanks for coming round.